leave you, I guess, with four points today and a couple of stories. The first one is, acknowledge that the cultural divide exists. I think often because, globalization is taking its course, we've got the internet, we've got free, communications, or nearly free Skype, Google, Viber, any of those other things that you can use to talk to people easily. We've got inexpensive travel. We've got global brands, and it's easy to assume that because we all have McDonald's and Banana Republic and The Gap, and things are starting to look a little bit less different, that somehow we are all more the same. But look, that's actually not true, because the real cultural differences are the ones that you can't see. So the first thing I would say is acknowledge that in an international business scenario, you are going to almost always have some kind of cultural divide that you'll have to deal with, even if you're dealing with Brits or Americans. The second thing I would say is know how that cultural divide is going to show up. So you need to actually think about what is this cultural divide thing? What does it look like? Again, look, I will try and condense this down to a couple of minutes, because we run a 6-hour workshop that talks about all this stuff. But essentially, in order to know how we're going to deal with those cultural problems, we need to know what culture is. Gert Hofstede is a really famous Dutch sociologist who's still working. His masterwork started back in the 1980s. He was working with IBM, and they surveyed and studied IBM teams all around the world. They came up with heaps of findings that Gert has turned into a bunch of books, but one of the key things that he came up with, which is a bit of a soundbite, is that culture is the software of the mind. So culture is really not, the clothes and the food and the way that you speak and what your architecture looks like. It's the way that we are programmed from the time we were tiny, and that is one of the reasons that it's so tricky to change. Now, if you think about what culture looks like, the really simple idea that I like to use is Edward Hall, and Hall is an American sociologist, Hall's iceberg theory. Has anybody heard of the iceberg concept? So if we think about an iceberg, what's the defining feature of an iceberg? 10% at the top, 90% on the water, and that is what culture is like. So all those things that we see, when you think International Cultural Festival, like Indonesia Week or something, China Week, or Japan Week, kimonos and sushi and whatnot, that's your 10%. And your 90% is your values, your attitudes, your beliefs, the way that you are brought up in your family, what happens when you go to school, how you are programmed as you go through university, what media you're exposed to. It's all this stuff that essentially programs how we think. And that is problematic because we can't see it. Once we study it, it's quite difficult to define. This is the stuff that causes all the problems. Now, if we want to move on and say, well, how do we measure culture? How do we deal with this? We basically need to set up some frameworks for measuring what we're dealing with. And again, if you look at various scholars have done lots of work on this, but Hofstede is again one of the most famous. And he set up this thing called the theory of cultural dimensions. And he came up with, I think, 5 cultural dimensions, then he expanded it to about 7. And I'm just going to pick out a couple. So each dimension is on a scale from 1 to 120, and different cultures, and again, it's a generalization, but different cultures tend to rank high or low on a scale.